Hello everyone, Sinter here with my Guilders 1 skill review project, and today I'm going to be talking about the Scythe Mastery attribute line in the Dervish profession. So there are 17 skills here, and most of them require you to wield a scythe, but not all of them, which is a rather interesting quirk. Anyway, let's go ahead and jump into it with Chilling Victory. 6 adrenaline, scythe attack. If it hits, this attack strikes for plus 13 damage. For each foe hit who has less health than you, that foe and all adjacent foes are struck for 26 cold damage. So this one right here is what I would consider a very commonly used skill. It's reasonably strong. Costing 6 adrenaline actually charges relatively quickly with a scythe if you're in a group of enemies. Now, one of the things that you're going to see with a lot of the scythe attacks is that they don't deal that much plus damage. 13 is pretty standard. If we're starting to get into higher numbers, like 17 is actually kind of high. And yeah, the 18 on that's quite high. So a lot of them around 13 is actually fairly standard. Just because scythes have a higher damage range to begin with, going up to 41 damage. But they also, because of their ability to hit multiple enemies, they get a lot more value out of these sorts of numbers. It means also that scythes work really well with, say, tactics skills that do like plus 26 damage or whatever. But Chilling Victory is just a really standard useful skill. If you're not going for any of the enchantment shenanigans that you get with a number of the other attack skills, then Chilling Victory is quite useful. You can hit up to 3 enemies with a scythe, so you can get potentially quite a lot of additional cold damage off of this as well, which can be nice. But as it is, this to me is like a 4. I don't bring it every time, but I certainly like it when I do. And the main reason why I don't bring it every time, to be clear, is because a lot of the time, skills that push this off are because I'm doing stuff that remove enchantments. And so those skills tend to be a little bit more powerful than this one to some extent, or have a little bit more utility or something. Pious Assault is a good example of a skill that I would argue is more powerful than Chilling Victory, but require you to be playing in the enchantment teardown sort of build that dervishes are kind of built around. And if I'm not going that direction, then Chilling Victory probably getting on my bar. But if I am, other skills might push it off. So it's just kind of where that sits. But very good skill and plays into that health theme that the dervish has of enemies that have less health. Most of the skills that do that, by the way, are going to have victory in their name. So you see Chilling Victory here, Crippling Victory also cares about that, and Victorious Sweep cares about that. I believe this naming actually probably comes from the warrior skill in Tactics, which I imagine this character should have, Thrill of Victory, which I think was one of the initial skills to have that if you have more health than target foe line. So that does come from Warrior. Obviously, right now I have nothing in Tactics, and this is already, like, plus 20 damage is way eclipsing what I'm getting off of most of my Dervish skills, so Thrill of Victory works real well on Dervish. Just something to point out there. But I believe that nomenclature of calling skills that have an additional effect if you do it to a foe with less health victories, at least for attacks. So that's something that we'll see. And Chilling Victory is quite solid. Crippling Sweep. 5 energy, 6 second recharge. So one of the things that you're going to notice is that dervishes have a very even mix of energy skills and adrenaline skills, including having one elite that's an adrenaline skill and one that is energy. I believe, if I remember correctly, I don't think dervishes originally had adrenaline skills on size, and then they added it later in some of the balance changes. So they have kind of a nice blend. They do have plenty of energy regeneration, but a lot of their energy goes towards doing stuff with enchantments. So you'll see a little bit of a mix. It's just something that I wanted to talk about here while I was thinking about it before we kind of leap into things. So 5 energy, 6 second recharge, scythe attack. If this attack hits a foe, that foe is crippled for 10 seconds. This skill deals 13 extra damage if that foe is moving. Well, I like this a lot better than Hamstring, which isn't saying much because I didn't like Hamstring at all. I prefer Crippling Victory or some of the other options for inflicting crippled, but this is not a bad choice if you want to inflict crippled. Dealing extra damage to moving foes is nice. I'm surprised this isn't called like Harrier's Sweep, but I think Harrier's Sweep Wait, it's not a thing? Huh. The reason why I say that, to be clear, is there's a couple of Harrier skills here that specifically have more effect against foes that are moving. And that's also a theme that's carried forth in Spears under the Paragon. So I would have expected Crippling Sweep to be called Harrier Sweep because it deals more damage to moving foes. This is okay. Cripple is a useful condition to inflict because it makes enemies move more slowly, which allows you to catch up to them and hit them. And it certainly... This is a skill that feeds into itself. You cripple an enemy so they can't move as quickly, which makes it easier to hit them again after the 6-second recharge to keep them crippled and deal that extra damage, because if they're trying to move while crippled, they're easier to catch up to, and so it's easier to get this off and all that sort of stuff. This feels like a 3 to me. I don't think it's a bad skill. It's just not a skill that I usually am using. It's certainly not a top-tier skill, and it's not like top-tier utility either, so it's just like, this is all right. That's how it feels to me. This feels like, it's all right. Crippling Victory. 6 Adrenaline Scythe Attack. If this attack hits a foe, that foe is crippled for 7 seconds. If you have more health than that foe, target foe, all adjacent foes take 26 earth damage. This is very similar to Chilling Victory. I like Chilling Victory a little bit better just because it deals more damage, which is usually preferable to inflicting crippled. I like this better than Crippling Sweep just because, yes, this inflicts crippled, but it has the AoE damage on it. That's a bit of an easier clause to match. This isn't always getting onto my bar, but it is sometimes getting onto my bar. I like it in the same sort of situations where I like Chilling Victory, honestly. The main issue there is I'm picking Chilling Victory before Crippling Victory, and often in that sort of build, I might be including like Victorious Sweep, which is quite good, and something like Radiant Scythe is often getting on there, and something like Mystic Sweep could get onto that sort of build too. So, Crippling Victory, I'm going to give a 3 to, but just keep in mind that's kind of a high 3. And the main reason why I'm giving it a little bit lower is just because it's kind of like just budging into the sort of like Chilling Victory range. I will say that I think I use Crippling Victory a lot more on secondary dervishes. So if I'm like doing a Scythe Warrior, or for some reason a Scythe Paragon or something like that, then Crippling Victory becomes a lot more attractive, especially on Warrior, just because Warrior doesn't necessarily have the energy throughput for Victorious Sweep. So that makes this as an adrenaline skill that does nice AoE damage and does not require enchantment shenanigans quite attractive. So just to kind of explain some of that. Okay, Eremites Attack. 5 energy, 6-second recharge, Scythe Attack. If it hits, this attack deals plus 8 damage and removes a Dervish enchantment. I don't think removing a Dervish enchantment is conditional on hitting. I think it's just when you use this attack, it removes a Dervish enchantment. And then if it hits, it deals plus 8 damage. If you did remove an enchantment, you deal an additional plus 8 damage and strike all adjacent foes. So basically this goes from hitting 3 foes to hitting all adjacent foes, so it goes up an area of effect. This sort of thing is useful on other weapons, like Cyclone Axe is really good because it, in Crude Swing, which is a hammer attack, those 2 attacks, for example, are really good. Death Blossom is really good because they hit area of effect, but the Scythe naturally hits area of effect and has a bunch of options for it, like Chilling Victory. So that makes Eremites Attack a lot less exciting just because the weapon it's for is already really good at area of effect, just naturally, and has a bunch of additional skills that are good at area of effect. That makes this a 3 for me in the it's okay sort of way. Like, this is an okay skill. But there's a lot of other competition that it has for skill slots, and adding all enemies instead of just 3 enemies in adjacent is just not a big enough increase for me to bring this a lot of the time. It's all right, which is why it gets a 3. But what's interesting to me about it is this sort of effect would be like auto-include sort of 5 territory if the Scythe itself didn't already have so many skills that hit area of effect and naturally hit area of effect. The fact that the scythe naturally hits up to 3 adjacent enemies, or basically hits your target and up to 2 adjacent foes to that target. The fact that that's an inherent part of scythe really diminishes the value of something like Eremites attack, whereas for other professions, that property is way more valuable and naturally will make this skill a much more valuable one. So that to me is really an interesting thing, and an interesting thing to observe and to contemplate. That brings us to Farmer's Scythe, which is what scythes are usually used for. They're usually used for farming. Specifically, you'd take them along and sweep through grain to cut it down efficiently. But Farmer's Scythe is 5 energy, 12-second recharge, scythe attack. If this attack hits, you deal plus 17 damage. If you hit more than one foe, it recharges instantly. This is an interesting one. It's a bit awkward to use. Excuse me. While scythes do have the ability to hit up to 3 foes, that's not by any means a given. You have to have enemies positioned, and you position yourself in such a way that you can actually take advantage of that. This is an okay skill. This is like another 3 for me. Like, this is fine. The additional damage on it is pretty solid for a scythe. And the fact that you can kind of spam it if you're in the right situation is really cool. Of course, energy intensive. Although the skill does not work with adrenaline. Actually, you could make this skill work with adrenaline. You could make it where it's like 5 adrenaline or something, 6 adrenaline without a recharge, and then if you hit more than one foe, you gain a bunch of adrenaline or something like that. You could do something like that, but I think it's a cleaner design when it's done this way. So it's all right, it's fine, but it's usually going to be pushed out by skills that have actual utility to them. All this does is a nice chunk of plus damage, and I can get that from different skills, so the spammability of this one looks more alluring than it actually comes up. That's been my experience with it when I've tried to work it. It's really awesome, those moments where you're like, oh man, I've got 2 or 3 enemies grouped here, and I'm just smacking them upside the head with all this Farmer Scythe damage, and then one of them walks away or dies, and all of a sudden it's on 12-second recharge. It's like, it reads more exciting than it actually plays, is what I'm saying. But I'm okay with skills that read more exciting than they actually play in a way that are obvious like this. So, Irresistible Sweep. Irresistible Sweep is 5 energy, 6-second recharge, scythe attack, deal plus 13 damage, and lose 1 Dervish enchantment. If you lose an enchantment in this way, Irresistible Sweep cannot be blocked, removes the stance, and deals plus 13 additional damage. So this hits for 26 additional damage if you remove a Dervish enchantment. This is also the Dervish's stance removal skill, which might be relevant. One of the things that's useful about this is that it is non-adrenal. It does not require adrenaline to remove one. That's relevant because the Paragon has a stance removal skill that does require adrenaline, and there's a couple of warrior ones as well. Usually the stances that I want to remove are going to be blocking stances, so not being able to be blocked and removing a stance are useful. This is not as this is an okay skill if you're not removing a stance, as long as you are in the sort of build where you want to remove Dervish enchantments, but it's not like the best of those sorts of skills. I would be inclined to bring it on that sort of build to an extent, but to me, the big winning value for this one is bring this to get rid of stances, and in that regard, I think it's quite strong. As far as stance removal goes, though, this is probably one of the best stance removal skills when it's not removing a stance, if that makes any sense, along with a Wild Strike in the Dagger Mastery. So I'm going to give this one, I think I'm going to give this one a 3. It's the sort of skill that would be a 2 were it not, like, useful enough. I don't feel like it's quite 4 territory. It's borderline. It's really borderline. This is almost a 4 for me. Just because I do feel that it is solid without removing a stance. But it's not quite there. It's, I don't know. If I'm not specifically bringing it to remove a specific stance from, like, so let me kind of, this is the sort of skill that if I'm going to an area where I know there's lots of stances, I'm really likely to bring this. So it's kind of like a 2, but it's like a 2 that's generally useful that bumps it up to a 3. if that makes any sense. That's kind of how I'm processing this. So it's a little bit of a difficult skill to evaluate. Every physical attacking profession wants stance removal, and I think all of them except Ranger have it. So this is the version for Dervish. So let's go ahead and move on to Lissa's Assault. So this is 5 energy, quarter-second activation time, which will make sense in a moment, 15-second recharge, Scythe attack. This attack interrupts an action if it hits, which is why it has a quick activation. If you are enchanted, any skill you interrupt is disabled for an additional 8 seconds. This attack deals 50% of normal damage. It's pretty typical for interrupts to deal less damage. I think that this is a pretty decent option for an interrupt skill. I like that it is actually rewarding you for being enchanted. I feel like a lot of the Dervish attacks want to remove enchantments or don't care. So the fact that this one rewards you is nice, and I appreciate that it's doing that. I think that this one's a decent I'm going to give this a 3. Like, it's a fine interrupt. I just don't typically bring interrupts on melee attackers very often. They can be useful on them. It's just that I tend to focus that functionality on Mesmers and Rangers because of the range. So this is interrupting stuff from melee attacks means that you're interrupting the person that you're currently attacking. It's really hard to run up to somebody and interrupt them because most skills don't have that long of a casting time. It works for some things like Meteor Shower that have absurdly long casting times, but for the most part, the fact that you have to be up in your enemy's face on a melee attack to interrupt means that melee range interrupt skills are just inherently less interesting to me. Not useless, but less interesting, less useful. So I prefer to use ranger interrupts like Savage Shot, and especially Mesmer interrupts like Cry of Frustration that work at a range. Cry of Frustration is probably one of the best interrupt skills in the game. Psychic Instability is arguably a bit stronger in certain circumstances, but takes up your elite slot. So I tend to focus on my interrupts being on those casters and on like Ranger at range and stuff like that, simply because the ability to do it without having to be right up on your enemy that you want to interrupt, or even like Disrupting Dagger, the Assassin Deadly Arts skill, is at range, right? Half range, but still at range. Being at range is just so much more useful for being able to say, oh man, you're about to do a thing that I want to stop. I'm going to interrupt you now. And it's useful on melee attackers to say, oh, you are using a skill while I'm attacking you. I'm going to interrupt it and disable it for a little bit of time. Like, all of that's useful, but not as generally useful. And I only have so many skill slots on a given character. What is that character doing? It's fine utility, and I'm happy to bring it, but I'm usually wanting other effects more, and that pushes something like Lissa's Assault off of my bar. So that's just kind of a general discussion of that sort of concept. Pious Assault. Pious Assault is 5 energy, 12-second recharge, melee attack. Yes, melee attack, unless this is some weird, incorrect dialogue that I could find out from concise skill descriptions. Let's see. Nope, still melee attack. The reason why I was checking that is because of Rending Touch that I was checking last time, which the standard skill descriptions do not indicate that it's touch range. The name does, but the concise description says this is a touch spell. So weird missed thing. But Pious Assault, apparently you can use this with any weapon, but you do have to spec into Scythe Mastery, which means that you're probably not using it with any weapon, even though that you can. It's 5 energy, 12-second recharge, like I mentioned. If it hits, it deals plus 18 damage, and it removes a Dervish enchantment. Obviously, anything that says removes a Dervish enchantment like this means it's removing one from you. If a Dervish enchantment was removed, this skill recharges 75% faster, and adjacent foes take 26 damage. This is a really good skill in the Teardown type build. Usually you're wanting to remove your enchantments for additional effects, and when this is plus 18 damage, recharges in 75% faster is 3/4 of that faster, which means that's 1/4, which means it's 3 second. When this has a 3-second recharge, deals 26 area of effect damage from each foe that you hit, and plus 18 damage on top. This is an extremely powerful skill. Extremely powerful. This is like the skill to use in that sort of build from an attack skill standpoint, along with Twin Moon Sweep, which we'll get to later. I I like this really well in those sorts of builds. But if I'm not removing a Dervish enchantment for myself, I don't want this skill. So, based on its raw power, I think I'm actually going to have to give this a 2. I'm going to have to give this a 2 as per, like, sort of the rules. Like, this is not... Because it's so easy to do the enchantment thing, it kind of goes up there a little bit, but, like, if I'm not doing the enchantment thing, I don't want this skill. If I am doing the enchantment thing, I probably do want this skill. That smells like more like a 2 to me than like a 4. It's really borderline 4 territory, but it's the sort of 2, 4... I don't know. It's difficult to kind of grade these sometimes. But this is a skill that I will bring a lot of the time. If I'm doing that one specific build. But if I'm not doing that build, I don't want this ever. So, it's a good design from that standpoint, where it's like, in this situation, it's super powerful, but if you're not in that situation, it's not very good. So I like that design. Yeah. Yep. And of course, it goes into the Dervish themes of removing enchantments from yourself, etc., etc. I don't feel like I need to reiterate that every time, but I figure it doesn't hurt to mention it. Radiant Scythe. 6 Adrenaline Scythe attack. This attack strikes for +1 damage for each point of energy you currently have, maximum 25 damage. That's an interesting design. You gain 6 energy if this attack hits. So the plus damage on this can be pretty solid. It's not why I bring this skill. I bring this skill because of the you gain 6 energy if it hits clause. This is really effective energy management, and honestly, this is a skill that I just often slot onto my bars. Dervish builds can get very expensive, especially if you have a lot of enchantment stuff that you're doing, things like that. They often become energy hungry, and that means I often want a Radiant Scythe. Not for the damage it can deal, although it can deal pretty reasonable plus damage. Like, plus 25 damage is really strong. But because of the energy gain from it. I will say also that I like this design space that this is touching. The design space of doing stuff based on the amount of current energy you have. It was touched on in Elementalist a little bit, and it's touched on a little bit here. I think it's a really interesting area, and I think it's really interesting with Adrenaline, especially on a profession that uses a lot of energy otherwise. So, cool design space, one that I would like to see explored a little bit more. Although I don't think it's very deep. I think it's difficult to get good effects in it. But that's just kind of a hunch and something I'd have to try out to see where it goes. So to me, this is like, it's a 4. It's borderline 5, but it's not quite 5. It's the sort of skill that I bring a lot of the time, but I don't bring it all the time, but I do bring it a lot of the time. So there are some builds like Pious Renewal type builds. I don't bring Radiant Scythe because Pious Renewal generates a bunch of energy and stuff like that. It becomes less interesting. But I do like this one and do bring it quite often. Reap Impurities. This is a very interesting skill. It's 5 Adrenaline, melee attack. So this actually works with any weapon as well for some random reason. I don't know why this is a melee attack and why Pious Assault's a melee attack, but here we are. If Reap Impurities hits, you deal +13 damage. Each foe you hit loses 1 condition. For each foe that loses a condition, all foes adjacent to that target foe take 34 holy damage. This is a really strange skill. You usually aren't wanting to remove conditions from your enemies, although, obviously, there can be times when you do. Fragility builds, for example. This, to me, is a great skill to bring in those sort of fragility builds. The builds where you're like, Fragility, which is a Mesmer Illusion Hex that makes you take damage whenever you gain or lose a condition. This plays really well in those sorts of builds. But outside of them, I'm not generally going to bring it. It does work reasonably well if you're fighting a bunch of undead and you're spreading around like weakness and stuff through some of your other effects. I pick weakness just because that's a really good condition to throw on undead pretty easily. But you can use crippled or other things too. But this works really well in those sorts of situations where it's like, haha, now you have a condition. Haha, now I'm taking that condition off, and all of you guys are being spiked for holy damage really hard because you're undead and you take double damage from holy. Outside of those sorts of circumstances where like maybe I'm doing some specific, like this plays well with Crippling Sweep, just because Crippling Sweep is a really reliable way, or Crippling Victory, either one, are a way of getting crippled on and then crippled onto the enemy and then reaping that impurity to deal AoE damage. Like, that's a reasonable combo to do. But I like this best in a fragility build and all that sort of stuff. I'm going to give this a 2. It's not a skill that I'm usually going to bring, but in very specific circumstances, I really do like it. Okay, that brings us to Reaper's Sweep. One of the 2... and I do like the design space this is playing around in, by the way. I should mention that. Playing around in removing conditions from enemies like this is a really cool spot. It does feel thematically like it's a very weak theme across a couple of different professions that kind of come together for a build. But I like that build sometimes, and it's a fun space to be able to play in, so I like the design. I felt like I needed to speak a little bit more on that. But let's go to Reaper Sweep. 8 Adrenaline, which is quite a lot of Adrenaline. Elite Scythe Attack. If this attack hits, you cripple your target for 13 seconds. Of course, this is each enemy you hit. You lose 1 Dervish enchantment. If an enchantment is removed, this attack knocks down for 3 seconds. I'm going to level with you guys. I'm not a big fan of this one. It's 8 Adrenaline. You have to lose the Dervish enchantment, or it is not worth 8 Adrenaline. You know how I know that? Because Crippling Victory is 6 Adrenaline and cripples foes, and Crippling Sweep is 5 energy and cripples foes. It's hard to have an exact analog, but Reaper's Sweep inflicting crippled is definitely not worth it. One of the other things that I actually have is a bit of a complaint about the design of Dervish. Here's the other elite. It also is a lose a Dervish enchantment. I really wish that one of these 2, Reaper Sweep or Wounding Strike, probably Reaper Sweep, benefited from being enchanted instead of removing an enchantment, or didn't care about enchantments at all, or something, so that way it could, like, I would like Reaper Sweep better if it was hit for plus damage for each enchantment on you, cap of like 60 plus damage or something ludicrous. A design in that space would be a much more compelling elite to me and a much more interesting skill than yet another elite that removes an enchantment. The knockdown is technically somewhat area of effect, but if you want area of effect knockdown, honestly, I think you're better off using Earthshaker, which, as a reminder, is in Hammer Mastery. And Earthshaker is also 8 Adrenaline. Target foe and all adjacent foes are knocked down. There's a failure with low Hammer Mastery, but, you know, you're using a hammer, you're going to have that high anyway. I think if you're going for that sort of thing, Earthshaker is a better choice. Obviously, you're using a different weapon. Scythes are arguably better than hammers on the broad strokes, but hammers are perfectly fine. So Reaper's Sweep to me is extremely underwhelming. It's very expensive at 8 Adrenaline. It's obviously a bit easier to build up Adrenaline on a Scythe if you're hitting multiple enemies than it is on a hammer. But basically, like, I've played around with this a little bit, and it's a little bit fun with Aftershock, the Elementalist point-blank area of effect Earth magic spell that deals more damage to knock down foes. But Reaper's Sweep is just very underwhelming to me, so I'm going to give this one a 2. I don't think it's quite bad enough to get lower, but I do think you have to kind of be building around the fact that this knocks down. It's very underwhelming to me. I might consider bringing this if it weren't elite sometimes. Right? At that point, it becomes like, okay, this is an okay sometimes skill. But as an elite, it's the elite slot it's competing for there's so many very solid options that the Dervish has. This to me is a very uncompelling design, and unfortunately it's what we've got. So in terms of what this skill is, and so that means I just don't use this very often because I do feel it's you have to be playing this remove an enchantment type build, and Wounding Strike is so much better than this is in that sort of build. So that's where it is, unfortunately. Rending Sweep is 6 Adrenaline. You'll notice a lot of the Adrenaline costs are a little bit high on Scythe. That's just because Scythe can build Adrenaline very easily. I think that's part of it. Anyway, 6 Adrenaline, Scythe Attack. This was also Scythe Attack, yeah. Rending Sweep deals plus 17 damage, and you lose a Dervish enchantment. If an enchantment was lost, you remove an enchantment from each foe you hit. This is a really interesting skill. it deals reasonable damage. It does have, like, it has a place in the self-strip sort of build, but it's kind of competing. So, like, that build is often going to want Pious Assault and Twin Moon Sweep ahead of Rending Sweep. I think Rending Sweep and, like, Irresistible Sweep can easily slot on that bar. Eremites attack can make it onto it on occasion. I do think Rending Sweep can have a place in it, but it's not one that I use that often. The enchantment removal is nice. Enchantment removal on attack like this is interesting. It does lose a little bit of value for me because most of the time the enchantments I want to remove are blocking enchantments, which this is not great for because this can be blocked. So, like, basically what I'm saying is that I prefer a Rending Touch over Rending Sweep, just because, like, there are times when this is useful, don't get me wrong. Shield of Absorption, Shielding Hands, removing those, this is really nice for, but a lot of the time, the ones that I'm most concerned about are, like, critical defenses on Raptors is always the one that comes to mind. Guardian, Aegis, those sorts of skills that give block chances that are enchantments, this is not as good against, so, because it can be blocked. The plus damage is all right. Where do I want to put this? I want to put this at like a 3. I feel like this is one of those skills that's like, it's okay. Yeah, I don't know. That's where I'm feeling for it. Twin Moon Sweep, 7 Adrenaline, melee attack, can be used with any weapon for some reason. Maybe sometime I should do some sort of weird thing where it's like, I'm a sword scythe build. It doesn't sound great, but it sounds amusing. Anyway, 7 Adrenaline melee attack, you lose 1 Dervish enchantment and gain 42 health. If an enchantment is lost in this way, you cannot be blocked, you strike twice, and you gain an additional 58 health. This is really good in any of the enchantment lose builds. There's a couple of reasons for it. First of all, hitting twice does deal a decent amount of additional damage, but it also, this heals you for quite a lot, which is really useful. And it's also an adrenaline skill. And being an adrenaline skill is surprisingly useful because those builds are often pumping most of their energy into, like, Pious Assault and their other enchantments that they're using. So this not requiring energy and instead being an adrenaline skill is really, really good in those contexts and for that sort of build. So this one, even on sort of the more casual stripping builds, so like Pious Assault may not get onto some of those, but Twin Moon Sweep often will. And so I like this one quite a lot. Works especially well with Avatar of Grenth, I should add. Because hitting twice when you're stealing 10 life is also really, really good. This also works really well with Vow of Strength, but you do have to be careful to make sure that you're putting other enchantments on, of course, and works super well with Splinter Weapon and all those sorts of things. So this is a really strong skill. It's not quite a 5. It's going to be a 4. Just because you do have to be playing in a way where you want to be losing enchantments. If you're not wanting to lose enchantments, if you're trying to do some sort of build where you're piling enchantments up, this is not a skill that I'd bring. But this is often a skill that I will bring. And this gets onto my bars more often than Pious Assault, I think. Victorious Sweep. 5 energy, 4-second recharge, melee attack. Also a random melee attack, not a scythe attack. Here we are, a bunch of random melee attacks in here. You can actually see this. If I switch over to here to a sword, you'll see that Mystic Sweep, like Chilling Victory gets a little scythe icon, but something like Victorious Sweep, Twin Moon Sweep, and Reap Impurities is a random melee attack as well. Like, these don't lose their icon when I swap to that, but if I swap to, you see the fist icon indicates it's a melee attack. Just wanted to point that out. So anyway, back to my scythe. Victorious Sweep, 5 energy, 4-second recharge, melee attack. If it hits, you deal plus 21 damage, and if target foe, which really means any foe, that you hit with it. But if target foe has less health than you, you gain 70 health. This is a really nice one. This is a very standard sort of skill for me to bring. It does really good plus damage at plus 21, which is unusually high for a Scythe. And then the healing is not exactly incidental. This can heal you for quite a lot as well. It might only care about the initial foe that you hit rather than each foe you hit. I'm not actually entirely sure on that. That would be... because a lot of these say each foe you hit versus specifically calling out... Because some of them say target foe. Like Crippling Victory says that. If this attack hits a foe, that foe is crippled for 7 seconds. If you have more health than target foe, all adjacent foes take damage. But this one... Yeah, I think this might actually... I'm a little confused. I think this might only be able to gain you 70 health. That's a little bit confusing. I'm not entirely sure. But this is still a really good skill. This is another 4. This will often make it onto bars where I'm building enchantments up on myself, because it just doesn't... Like, it doesn't care about enchantments one way or the other. So this is a very standard, very useful skill. I really appreciate that it exists. That's really all I got to say about it. Does play into that health theme, etc. But I've talked about that enough. 6 adrenaline for Weary Strike. 6 adrenaline Scythe Attack. You remove 1 Dervish enchantment from yourself. If an enchantment was removed, you inflict a deep wound for 9 seconds. You suffer from weakness for 10 seconds if an enchantment was not removed. So this is the deep wound, the generic deep wound inflicting skill. Deep wound is good. You do have to be doing the enchantment removal thing. That comes up a lot, unfortunately. Wearying Strike is playing in kind of a space that both Dervish and Paragon play around in a bit, which is if you are not under some condition or whatever, you inflict weakness on yourself. Inflicting weakness on yourself isn't great. You definitely don't want to do that. I don't use this one very often. I'm going to give it a 3. Deep Wound is a strong condition. You are playing in the condition or in the enchantment removal thing, though. And that's one of the things that we can see through a lot of these attacks. A lot of them are either they don't care about enchantments or they remove enchantments. And unfortunately, removing enchantments is such a prevalent part of Scythe attacks that you're either in a build that wants to remove enchantments or you're not using those attacks. And that really limits the number of attacks that you can use outside of those specific sorts of builds. So unfortunately, just the way that things play out, if you're making a build that wants to keep your enchantments around and you're using a Scythe to attack, which you probably are, you're probably using like Victorious Sweep, some combination of like Chilling Victory, Crippling Victory, and like maybe Lyssa's Assault, probably Radiant Scythe. I mean, there's not many attacks in Scythe Mastery to begin with, but it does have a kind of a limited pool outside of that, and so there's like only a handful of skills that kind of rise to the top of that, and things like Chilling Victory and Victorious Sweep tend to end up there. So it's a little bit awkward design-wise, that so many of them want you to remove an enchantment, and I wish there were a few more Mystic Sweep type skills that are like, if you are enchanted, I do a bonus thing, rather than I remove an enchantment to do a bonus thing. But that's kind of my feelings on the matter. Wearying Strike is alright, but it's far from exciting. But I'm glad that this exists as like scythes deal deep wound this way. Speaking of inflicting deep wound, here's Wounding Strike. 5 energy, 3 second recharge, elite scythe attack. If this attack hits, you deal plus 17 damage. And target foe suffers from bleeding for 17 seconds, and you lose the Dervish enchantment. If an enchantment was removed, that target foe also suffers from deep wound for 17 seconds. So this is really powerful. I don't tend to use it that often, but inflicting bleeding and deep wound is nice, and the plus 17 damage is good, but you do have to, like, again, you don't have to build around removing enchantments often for this to work well. The plus 17 damage and the 17 seconds of bleed do not require you to remove an enchantment, but the deep wound does, and this will remove an enchantment regardless. I can see using this with a build, or on a build, that only removes enchantments occasionally, I don't know what build that is, but I can see it on a build that does that, because not every hit has to remove an enchantment to be able to get good benefit from it. 17 damage, of course, not requiring it. The problem is, this always does remove an enchantment, so you're never going to use this in a build that wants to keep enchantments around. Again, it's the issue here. I don't use this that often. I'm going to give this a 3. Keep in mind, this is trying to compete against the avatars. Vow of Strength, Hammer Mastery. I need to close you because you're in my way. Vow of Strength and Onslaught, which I went way past. All of those are extremely powerful skills. So, on the one hand, most of the elite scythe attacks are kind of like okay to underwhelming, because Reaper's Sweep is underwhelming and Wounding Strike is fine, but they are competing in an elite slot tier that is very difficult for them to make it onto. Even Pious Renewal tends to be a skill that I prefer over Wounding Strike. It fuels a build. Wounding Strike is just like, yeah, I'm good. It's like, okay, do you do more than be good? And it's like, no. Like, all right then. That's just kind of how it ends up. And that finally brings us to Zealous Sweep. 5 energy, 10-second recharge, scythe attack. If this attack hits, you deal plus 17 damage, which is fine. You gain 3 energy and 1 strike of adrenaline for each foe you hit. This feels like another 3. It's fine. The recharge is a little bit longer than I like my attack skills to be, but it counterbalances that by gaining me a decent amount of energy and a decent amount of adrenaline. So if you hit, like, the dream is you hit 3 foes with this, and you gain 9 energy and 4 adrenaline. Keep in mind you're gaining an adrenaline, 6 adrenaline, because you'll gain 1 adrenaline for each foe that you hit, plus an additional adrenaline. So the wording of this might be a little confusing. Any hit you make gains you a strike of adrenaline. This will gain you an additional strike of adrenaline on top of that. So it will gain you at least 2 strikes of adrenaline if you hit 1 foe, which hopefully you do. It will gain you 4 strikes of adrenaline if you hit 2 foes, and 6 strikes of adrenaline if you hit 6 foes. So this can gain you a lot of adrenaline very quickly. And I think it's a perfectly reasonable skill. It's just fine. It's not... Again, it comes down to, like, if you look at a lot of the scores, there's a lot of 3s going along a lot of Scythe Mastery. Sorry, I was just double checking to make sure that was a Scythe attack and not randomly a melee attack. So a lot of these skills are fine. It's just there's a couple that really stand out. Chilling Victory, for example, Radiant Scythe, Victorious Sweep, Twin Moon Sweep. In certain situations, Pious Assault becomes really exciting. Irresistible Sweep is one that can definitely push its way up there. So a lot of these, like, they're fine skills, just tend to kind of get a little bit forgotten in the mix for me. So that's where this one is. I think it's fine, but it's not highly memorable to me. So I like the design space that this is in, though, in terms of gaining you additional adrenaline and energy. So I don't know, maybe I should consider this one a little bit more highly than I do. Maybe every now and then it should push out Radiant Scythe, eh? Maybe. But Radiant Scythe usually goes on builds where I want, like, a lot of energy. So this requiring energy and not necessarily even refunding it makes the Radiant Scythe a little bit more exciting. I'm going to go ahead and wrap up here because I've gone through all of these skills. So next time we will be finishing off the Dervish with Wind Prayers. Until then, everyone, take care and goodbye.